add value to your business, or do you want to just be this administrative person?
And often if you look at your talent team and the caliber of talent in your company, they correlate.
You could hire the best person for the job if they were in your candidate pool.
All these individual employees, one by one, together, their voices all come together to articulate the culture of the company.
There's the promise of AI, and then there's the what can we do very tangibly right now that adds value to many of our stakeholders, including passive candidates.
Hi everyone, Britt Ryan, head of recruiting at Intello, back again for another episode of Hiring on All Cylinders. Joined again with my fearless colleague, Sean Simmerly.
Fearless, I like that. That's a new one.
Yeah, absolutely. You got to be fearless if you're going to do back-to-back podcasts at HR Tech. And we're also joined by Sjoerd Gehring, who is the global head of talent acquisition at Johnson & Johnson. And interestingly, you also have another title that I discovered when I was sleuthing around, that you are a millennial ERG.
That's right.
At J&J. So welcome, and would love to hear a little bit more about what those two titles mean.
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me.
Our pleasure, yeah.
Global head of recruiting for J&J, obviously responsible for the hiring across all of our businesses, all of our levels at Johnson & Johnson. And in addition to that, I actually also lead our employee experience efforts for the company. So how we think holistically about the end-to-end experience the people who work for J&J experience throughout their careers. And then given the fact that we hire and retain so many millennials around the world, how do we do that well from a millennial engagement perspective? And so I also have the pleasure of leading our millennial employee resource group for the company.
That's fascinating. So, I mean, as a millennial, I guess I have to ask, what are some of the things that your team is kind of pursuing to make sure that millennials feel engaged? Because there are so many generalizations around millennials and their, lack of kind of engagement.
Absolutely. I think one of the first things that we're trying to resolve is to demystify the millennial generation. Like, I think so many articles are being written right now around, buyer values of the millennial generation that are, half-truths or are completely incorrect. And so one of the main objectives that the millennial ERG for the company has is to really demystify the generation and to much better understand what the behaviors, expectations, and buyer values are of millennials who work for Johnson & Johnson around the world. Right? So a millennial in China is looking for different things in their career than a millennial here in the US. And so there's huge value in there for J&J to better understand what millennials are looking for and how we need to evolve our company really in order for us to be able to retain that talent.
So interesting. And just out of curiosity, how do you define a millennial at J&J? What does that look like? Because kind of to your point, there are so many different data points and different describers for what a millennial actually is.
Yeah, we actually love to look at it in a way that there's millennials in the pure definition of the year that you were born at, but then there are so many also millennials at heart. At J&J. So people who very much have the same buyer values as millennials at the company, who might have been born, officially part of a different generation. We really don't segment it that way. We're looking at creating a much better experience for all people at J&J, regardless of the generation. So I think the main takeaway here is we are trying to become much more almost obsessed about what people who work for the company are actually expecting, what they're looking for. So we're much better informed to shape the company moving forward based on those expectations.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you, jumping back a little bit, you mentioned kind of demystifying the millennial generation, right? I think that, in general, there's also this kind of lack of transparency that I think millennials oftentimes seek transparency. And kind of curious, do you find that millennials or really anyone at J&J pursue transparency more now than they did before? What does that kind of look like?
I think from a transparency perspective, absolutely. I think one of the main things that we're seeing is that, as consumers on a day-to-day basis, we have these expectations around the experiences that other companies provide, right? When you think about Amazon or Uber or Netflix, we have those same experiences as employees or as candidates in our recruiting process because we're used to them on a daily basis as consumers. And so one of the things that we're really trying to do at Johnson & Johnson is to bring a much more consumerism approach to the way we think about employee experience and the way we think about recruiting. And so one of the things, and obviously part of that consumer expectations, transparency is a huge aspect of it, right? So if you, I'm originally from Europe and grew up in Amsterdam, and when I want to send a birthday package to one of my friends or my family members, my expectation is that I can track that birthday package from New York City, where I live, all the way to Amsterdam. I always want to know where that package is. I want to know when they receive it. And so candidates in our recruiting process have that exact same expectation. And so what we're very focused on is how can we bridge that gap between the consumer expectations that we all have on a daily basis and the lack of the delivery of that experience across the recruiting process.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And are there specific trends that you've seen around that? Because I couldn't agree more. When you think about where our society is, where social media is, we have extreme expectations for everything as a consumer, as a customer, around engagement. And so curious, around the trends that you're seeing, or what are the things that you think are going to be really important as we see this continue to evolve?
Yeah, that's a great question. Where we started our journey is to really better understand what candidates are looking for. To your exact same point, the trends tend to go a little crazy year over year. They're a little bit overhyped as well. But when you really peel it back to its core, what we found that candidates are looking for in the recruiting process isn't all that much. It's transparency, right? So if you, and I think we've all been in that position where we found this great job on a company's careers website, you take maybe 15-20 minutes to really refine your resume to match that particular job. You go through the application process, and then you experience this black box experience where you either never hear back or you might hear back 2 months later. And so it isn't a completely unrealistic expectation from candidates to say, you know what, I would like to better understand what your end-to-end recruiting process is. My expectation is to be able to track my progress throughout your recruiting experience and manage my expectations a little bit in terms of how long the process will take. And so when you bring it back to those basics, regardless of the trends, you create a much higher candidate engagement, much higher levels of candidate satisfaction, and that's what we're trying to do with J&J.
Yeah, and is that something that you're trying to build in-house then, or are there, other vendors in the HR tech space that you're partnering with? And I think I know where you're going of this idea that I apply and then basically have like a login to J&J and can see the roles I've applied for and what the status is and so on.
That's exactly right. And it's such a relevant question for HR tech, right? Because as our team at J&J prepares, how are we going to HR tech? What are the vendors that we're looking to consider for our ecosystem? I think one of the things that we're very passionate about is let's not go after the shiny objects year after year that we add to an already very disconnected tech ecosystem around HR. And so where we started was, what do we want the candidate experience to be for candidates that apply to jobs at J&J? And then once you've defined what you like that experience to be, we then took a step back and said, well, which one of those applications do we want to buy? And which applications do we want to build ourselves or partner with a third-party vendor to build for J&J? Because if we buy everything off the shelf, then the candidate experience isn't going to be any different from any other company buying the same applications. And so exactly where you were just going, Brad, we have partnered with an organization to build a custom digital experience for J&J candidates, which we're about to launch next week, that will give them a sense of much greater transparency in terms of what that end-to-end recruiting experience looks like at J&J, where they are in that recruiting experience, but also a clear signal from J&J that we want to put some skin in the game in terms of how we make you more successful as a candidate. So think a curated content experience that actually helps candidates prepare for whatever might be next in that recruiting process.
That's awesome.
I love all of that.
Yeah, and congratulations on the forthcoming release. That's awesome.
Fingers crossed.
Hey, exactly. So, there are so many trends. You tweeted actually recently that AI is no longer a sci-fi, science fiction fantasy. So I'm kind of curious, on one end, you want more transparency about active applicants, but on the other end, there's this kind of new brainchild AI that's very mysterious. How do we keep that transparent? And especially for passive applicants or passive candidates, how do we kind of balance that?
that's a great question, and I actually don't think AI is a trend anymore. To your earlier point, it's something that we're very much embracing at J&J. We very much think that AI has a very significant role to play in the future of recruiting and the future of employee experience. I think of the future of work in general as a much larger trend that we're trying to really wrap our heads around and form a point of view on. I think, with AI, as with many other technologies or kind of newer technologies, there's the promise of AI, and then there's the what can we do very tangibly right now that adds value to many of our stakeholders, including passive candidates. And when you bring it down to its core essence, there's probably a handful of very tangible use cases where AI plays a very valuable role today. And so, for example, J&J and Google recently implemented Google's Jobs API, and bringing much better search results for passive job or active job applicants, and proactively suggesting much better matches for their background and profile. Real value, real AI use case. Doesn't necessarily lean into the promise of AI yet,
Sure.
but a very valuable use case right now. So the way we're thinking about it is to pilot very valuable and tangible AI use cases before we really scale and take a broader look at it.
Yeah.
I think I'm so curious about this, having worked at much larger companies and now working at smaller companies like an Intello. But when I think of J&J, one of the things that I always think of with a company that size is that when you look at any initiative, it's like trying to turn the Queen Mary in terms of scale.
Yep.
And how do you decide what you're going to do and face the challenges of, we could be implementing something that's this hot technology, and by the time we actually get down the road with it, it's yesterday's news.
Right.
So when you talk about scale, what are some of the factors that go into play for you as you think about the long-term plan of going from inception to actually like getting your career site to launch? Because I'm sure that did not wasn't an idea you took on last week.
Doesn't happen overnight, unfortunately, but there's a strength in there. I think we really look at the scale of the organization as a core strength of it as well. I think everyone who works for J&J has really internalized just the real impact that the company has on the world. Right? Our products and services touch over 1 billion people every single day, and the impact that we have on patients and consumers around the world is real and is a real responsibility as well. So when we start to think about how do we look at implementing and staying ahead of different technologies in the recruiting and the broader HR space, is we always look at, can we provide value for candidates around the world? So let's not look at it as a developed market, US-centric solution. So global scalability is a really important part. Whether or not the organization plays well in the broader sandbox and ecosystem, right? So there's so many, again, shiny products and solutions that do something pretty well in isolation, but being able to integrate and play well with the broader ecosystem is ultimately much more important. And then the real added value to our candidates is another kind of criteria that we always look at and is incredibly important to the company.
That's awesome. So want to kind of jump back to a slightly different topic here, but talking about scale, talking about candidate experience, and also talking about some of the matching criteria that you were mentioning earlier between Google and J&J. Where do we see potential mishaps as far as that matching criteria when you're trying to find candidates that might not have that stereotypical background? So you actually tweeted about this as well, but trying to hire people that don't necessarily have that experience in that industry as being a way to increase diversity within your company. So how do you balance that as well? Like you're trying to introduce these new things that make the candidate experience better, match people with new jobs, but at the same time, extolling the virtues of finding people that don't necessarily fit that cookie cutter description.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, and it's a really hard thing for us to address, because if you think about, so many building blocks of the recruiting industry that we both kind of live and work in haven't been disrupted in decades, right? So when you look at the building blocks like a resume or a job description or a careers website or lack of transparency in that process, there are a few things that we need to disrupt first before we can add real value there for candidates. There's two ways that we look at this. Like, I think we really think about, this space as a culture add versus a culture fit, right? So from a diversity perspective, that's a real important building block for the company. The second thing is, again, it goes back to transparency and managing expectations. I don't believe that the use case of matching is actually getting you a better match for the background or the profile that you have today, but it's understanding what your aspiration is in the future and being able to match jobs for your future aspiration and then showing the delta between the two, right? So if we can show you a match for a job that you might be interested in 2 years from now, and if I can add value as a company to your career path in terms of, recommending different online learning programs to build the skills that you need for that job, or to show you what experiences that you need to gain in order to be a very qualified candidate for that job, I think ultimately that's the bigger social responsibility and opportunity that we have as a company to add value in that way for job seekers.
I love that.
Yeah, can you create that? That sounds like an amazing candidate experience.
It does. Well, and it's the full life cycle too of retaining your people and offering them that mobility that keeps them at J&J. I always find, still, perhaps not as often as generations older than ours, but you still find that when you talk to people and they say, oh, I've been at this company for 8 years, and it seems like you're a dinosaur at that company if you've stayed that long. But the reality is, if you are continued to be challenged and you continue to learn, you'll stay.
Absolutely.
And so that's, it's all part of that, retention piece too.
Yeah, it's enriching your experiences. I think what we're seeing a lot of, J&J employees being very focused on, it isn't necessarily about upward development. It isn't necessarily about, getting a bigger title sooner in your career. It's really about the development of different experiences and really enriching your background, because I think what we're able to show is that once you develop those different skills and experiences, that's where you get really interesting jobs.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, do you have any more questions, Britt?
I could sit here and talk with you all day, but I'm sure you have a pretty packed agenda. So I just want to thank you very much for joining us. And I'm certainly going to go to J&J's career site next week. And I will openly admit that I sometimes apply for jobs just to see what the user experience is like.
Amazing.
And then see how I can sort of capture that, in what I'm doing. So,
well, hopefully we're always getting better. And thanks so much for having me. We appreciate it.
Absolutely.